Hi, I'm Russ Lowenthal with the Oracle Database Security Product Management Team, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about going beyond password authentication, in particular about Kerberos and the Oracle database. Your Oracle database supports 5 different ways to authenticate. There's password authentication, simple username and password, probably the most common form of authentication. There's Kerberos authentication, which is today's topic and probably the second most common form of authentication. You can authenticate via PKI certificate or TLS certificate. You can authenticate via Radius, which is how you would get to biometrics or token-based authentication. Or you can authenticate based on your membership in the operating system user or operating system group. Now, as I said, Kerberos is the second most used form of database authentication, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. It is a great way to integrate with Active Directory. Every domain controller is also a Kerberos distribution center. If you're working in a Windows environment, your desktop or laptop automatically gets issued a Kerberos ticket when you log in, and so it's really your least intrusive way to integrate with Active Directory, requiring absolutely no changes, no schema extensions, no software installations, no changes at all to your domain controllers. And for that reason, it's very popular with your Active Directory administrators. Let's take a quick look at Kerberos authentication in action. We'll start by checking to see if we have an existing ticket. We run OKList, there's no ticket there, so we'll run OKinit and our username to retrieve a ticket, and we'll give our password in Active Directory. Now that we've done that, we can see we do have a Kerberos ticket, and that Kerberos ticket was issued to rlowenth@dbseclabs.com. We'll use that to log into the database, and when we check to see what schema we were mapped to, we see that we're Russ. Now, why did we get mapped to Russ? Well, let's take a look at how Russ is defined in the data dictionary. And what we're going to do is we're going to check the username or schema name in the database and compare that with the external name that was defined. So we'll get our session shown up, so this comes up in looking well, and we'll take a look at DBA users, pulling back username, password, and external name from DBA users. And we'll just filter out so we only see the ones where the password isn't null, because we want to see our external and global users. And what we can see is that Russ is defined externally as rlowenth@dbseclabs.com, which you'll remember was what was in my Kerberos ticket. Now, let's take a look at our sys context, and we want to take a look at the external name that is associated with my session. This is who I actually logged in as, and sure enough, we can see rlowenth@dbseclabs.com. And when we take a look still in sys context, and this time at our authentication method, we can see that we authenticated using Kerberos to get to the database. So, very simple. We didn't have a ticket, we got a ticket, and we used it to authenticate. Now, what set this up for us is that in my sqinet.ora, I have defined my Kerberos parameters, and I've allowed Kerberos as an authentication mechanism. And in my krb5.conf file, I've defined where the domain controller is, what my @KDC is. I've defined what port I'm listening on. I've defined what my realm looks like, or my Kerberos setup looks like. So this is where all of the parameters for Kerberos go, is in the krb5.conf file. Now let's take a little bit closer look at configuring Kerberos. As you saw in that demo, there's configuration behind the scenes that makes Kerberos work. On the database server, you have your sqinet.ora, where you define your Kerberos parameters that tell the database to use Kerberos. You have your krb5.conf that tells the database what Kerberos looks like, what the different parameters are for that. You have something called a key tab file, I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, that allows the database to authenticate to Active Directory. You have your etc host files and etc services that define IP addresses and services, and then you have the externally authenticated users. In Active Directory, you have your service account that the database uses to connect in and check the Kerberos tickets, and this service account must match the database server name. You also have the users themselves that you're going to create and the groups for the database. And then on the client side, as I showed you, you have your sqinet.ora and you have your krb5.conf file. And in rare cases, you may have to update Etsy services or Etsy hosts. Let's take a look at that krb5.conf file, our Kerberos Configuration File. We start with the main section, libdefaults, which is where we set up all of our parameters that define how Kerberos is going to operate. In my case, I have clock skew, which says how far apart the clients and servers are allowed to be from the Kerberos distribution center or domain controller. I tell my configuration what my default Kerberos realm is going to be. That's usually the same as the domain name. And I specify, is the ticket going to be forwardable or not? There's a lot more that can go in here. You can specify encryption types. You can specify, include other files. There's just a ton that can go into libdefaults. The next section is extremely important because this tells my Kerberos configuration that for a given Kerberos realm, company.com, where is the server for this realm or the servers for this realm. Now here what I've done is I've said just go to company.com on port 88, and company.com in domain name services is all of my Active Directory controllers. So it's an easy way to not have to list specific controllers. I could point to a load balance here, or I could just do a list, a comma separated list of different IP addresses if I wanted to. The next section, domain realm, is one where you'll probably spend a lot of time, because this is where you tell your database server that if you get a Kerberos ticket that comes in from company.com, what realm do you go to? If it comes from us.oracle.com, what server alias should handle those requests? And in a lot of organizations, your Active Directory setup is very complex. You have a master domain, and then you have many child domains set up into a forest, if you will. And so domain realms is how you navigate that forest to find out which servers are actually going to be servicing the requests for Kerberos. We move on from our krb5.conf to one that you're probably all very familiar with, and that's your sqinet.ora. And in your sqinet.ora, probably the most important thing you do is you set your authentication services to include Kerberos or Kerberos 5 pre. That tells the database to use Kerberos. And then you set up again clock skew. Are you going to have the database fall back to password authentication if Kerberos fails? What do you want your Kerberos service name to be? In my case, I picked it Oracle. Where is that krb5.conf file? If you're on the database, you're going to point to something called a key tab. More on that in just a few seconds. If you're on a client, where are your Kerberos tickets going to be? You'll notice I have MSLSA, which says it's in memory. I'm on a Windows 10 box there. But basically, this is where you tell the database side how it's going to interact with the Kerberos side and perform your authentication. There's other places where you'll need to go to configure Kerberos authentication. You'll need to issue the database a key tab. I've said several times that I would talk to you about this later. Well, now it's later. This is something that is created on the Active Directory server, the Kerberos Distribution Center, and it produces basically a file-based token. Here I've called that database.keytab, but you can call it anything you want to. And that key tab file is what the database uses to connect to Active Directory to validate tickets or to validate an incoming connection. So it only exists on the database server, and it is related to the server, not the database. The service account that you create the key tab for will always match the database server name. Here my database server is called dbserver.company.com, so I've got a user in the database whose principal name is dbserver.company.com. And when I issue the key tab, that's what that's used for. Another file that you may have to edit, very seldom, but you may have to edit, is Etsy services. Etsy services needs to tell the Kerberos stack within the database what port it's going to use. Now the default port is port 88. You will almost always see this is already there in Etsy Services, but sometimes you will see that instead of saying Kerberos 5, and we use Kerberos version 5, the services file just says Kerberos, in which case you may have to manually add in a Kerberos 5 alias to point to that port 88. You'll notice that we have this defined for both TCP and UDP in Etsy Services. Depending upon your version of the database, you may be starting with UDP and then failing over to TCP if UDP doesn't work, or if you're in more recent versions of the database like 21C and up, we don't even try UDP, we just default to TCP because so many of us are blocking UDP in our internal firewalls. As I said, the key tab file has to be issued to a service account that matches the database server name. And it's important to make sure that whatever that service account is, it matches exactly what the database thinks its server name is. So here you can see that my database host name is DB server, and when I do a host command on that, I see that my database resolves to dbserver.company.com. Another file you may be editing is your Etsy hosts. If you're not resolving your server name, your fully qualified server name through DNS, then Etsy host will do that by the first entry after the IP address. If you've reversed this and you've done DB server first and then dbserver.company.com, you may find you need to switch that back in your Etsy hosts. Our final step is actually one of the more fun pieces. Now we're going to go ahead and create our database schemas and do that using Kerberos Authentication. We have two options here. If we're doing Kerberos only, then it would be create user, in my case Russ, identified externally as rlowenth@company.com. If we were doing this with global users, in other words, the users are authenticated and identified and authorized in Active Directory, so centrally managed users rather than just Kerberos, then it would be create schema, give it the Active Directory username, something like rlowenth, identified globally as, and then the distinguished name of the user in Active Directory. And that's all it takes. At this point, you're ready to go, and you begin to test your Kerberos configuration to make sure that everything works. Let's suppose things don't work, that something is wrong amongst all the files that you've changed and all the setup you've done. Now you're into trying to find out where the error is and fix the errors. So we're going to switch to common issues and troubleshooting for this next segment. When it comes to troubleshooting Kerberos Authentication, you'll find that network tracing is one of your best friends, and you will need both the client and server trace in order to troubleshoot. Now, here's a pro tip for you. You want to make sure that you leave trace level server commented out until you're ready to begin generating the trace files. This reduces the number of trace files that get generated by other sessions and background processes and keeps it from filling up your file system. When you're ready to begin your test, uncomment trace level server, run the test, and then immediately comment it again. Another tip, diag and _ADR enabled. If this is not set to off, then all diagnostics go to the diagnostics directory in Oracle Base and ignore your trace directory parameters. So if you want to make sure you're putting your trace files where you want them to be, you set diag _ADR enabled equals off. And the final tip on this one, and I can't tell you how much time this has saved me. It's easy to find the client trace for your Kerberos authentication attempt because you don't have a lot of other activity on your client. But it's sometimes difficult to find the server trace. Here's how you do that. Take a look in the client trace, and you're going to find a string called NAS_CCN that will have a connection ID in it. Once you have that connection ID, grep for that connection ID in your server trace directory. The file that has that connection ID is the server trace that corresponds to your client trace. With both of those together, you've got both sides of the communications and authentication attempt, and it becomes much easier to troubleshoot your Kerberos issues. One of the common issues that you'll find when initially configuring Kerberos, and sometimes during normal operations of Kerberos, is a case where there is a key version number mismatch in the key tab. This generally happens because you've issued the key tab from the domain controller, you've copied it over your database server, and then sometime after you issued the key tab, somebody went in and updated the service account in Active Directory, usually changing the password. When that password is updated, it invalidates any existing key tabs, and you need to generate a new key tab with a new key version number. This will be very obvious in your trace files. It will tell you that it is looking for key version number 4 and it found key version number 3, or it's looking for key version number 5 and it found key version number 6, or number 4, excuse me. It'll always be earlier. So if you see this, all it means is you need to regenerate your key tab file. A great way to test to see what key version number you have is to simply use either klist or oklist, both of them will do this for you, to print out what the current key version number is in your key tab file, and then use the kvno command to print out what the current version is in Active Directory. Now, another pro tip. There's an environment variable, krb5_config. If you set this to your databases krb5.conf, this is what will override the default krb5.conf for the operating system and allow you to use those OS utilities like klist and kvno with your database configuration. So export your krb5_config, and at that point you can run klist, you can run kvno, and it works just like it was an Oracle utility. That's it for Kerberos authentication. Just keep in mind what we covered today. Kerberos is a very popular database authentication. In fact, the second most popular right after username and passwords, and it solves a lot of business requirements. You want centralized authentication? You've got that with Kerberos authentication. You want to be able to immediately make a user unable to log into all databases when they leave the organization without having to go and touch every database individually. Disabling the account in Active Directory means you can no longer get a Kerberos ticket, and therefore if that account is Kerberized, Kerberos authenticated, they can't log in anymore. It's one of the easiest ways to do integration with Microsoft Active Directory. It isn't as full-featured as centrally managed users. You don't get the advantage of shared schemas. You don't get the advantage of mapping database roles to Microsoft Active Directory groups, but you do get that critical authentication step. It does qualify as a strong authentication mechanism. Kerberos is widely recognized as a very good way to manage authentication, and it gives you single sign-on with your Windows desktop, which can really make life easier for your power users who are trying to log into the database, not having to worry about what is their database password and what is their desktop password. Kerberos works with SQL+, with SQL Developer, with Toad, with most database utilities. Also keep in mind, as we've seen here today, enabling Kerberos in your system requires changes to the database and to the clients. There are a lot of moving parts to consider. Remember what we talked about when it comes to troubleshooting Kerberos authentication. You need to have how to set up database network tracing down. It's the trace files that are almost always going to point the way to the problem. If you'd like to learn more about database security, I want to recommend two resources to you. One of them is Oracle Live Labs. Live Labs gives you hands-on testing with the Oracle database security features, options, and products. You can use the Oracle Cloud to provision an environment in just a few minutes, and you get a great guided walkthrough of exactly how the features works and some of the use cases that we expect them to be used for. Another resource I want to make sure you're aware of is Database Security Office Hours. We hold these the second Wednesday of each month, and you can subscribe to those at bit.ly/AskTomDBSec. There's 2 sessions on the second Wednesday. Just pick the one that is at a time that works best for you. The content is identical, and I hope to see you in office hours sometime soon. Here's a few other resources you might be interested in. We've got database security pages on oracle.com and on the Oracle Technology Network. We have a blog that we publish in whenever there's anything interesting or new that you might want to hear about for database security. Our team also creates an electronic book called Securing the Database. We're on our 4th edition of this, and it's a walkthrough of really everything from soup to nuts for securing the database, why we did what we did when we created it, what use cases we envisioned for the product and features. A good resource for kind of a high-level overview of database security. I already mentioned live labs and office hours, and again, hope to see you in one of those soon. Again, thanks for giving me some of your time today. Hopefully with what you've learned in today's session, you'll be able to configure Kerberos, use Kerberos effectively, and when something goes wrong or if something goes wrong, troubleshoot to find what the problem is and get it resolved quickly. Thanks again. Hope to see you in another session.